Andrea, I am so excited to have you back on the Allsorts podcast.
It's really exciting to be back. It's been, I think, a few years now.
Yeah, I feel like you were like season one. I feel like you were like one of the first people I ever interviewed for the podcast. And, there's like no shortage of things to talk about in terms of gut health. And I really, really love it when I get to geek out with another gut health RD.
Yeah, we're going to have lots of fun today. My favorite topic, constipation.
Right.
So
everybody poops.
That's a song we sing in our house all the time.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think one of the things, especially because we are going to talk about poop, which is, still like a little bit of a taboo subject. Like no one wants to admit that poop is a part of their lives, even though like every single one of us does it. I think one of the things that's really helpful to sort of destigmatize is for like us to sort of share our experience, because of course, like what gut health RD went into gut health without something going on with their own gut. So like, why don't you tell us a little bit about like your gut health origin story?
Yeah. So I never thought I would end up working in digestive health, but that's where I ended up. I worked in clinical nutrition and I struggled with irritable bowel syndrome. And being who I am, I like to know everything about everything in a really granular level. So I dove really deep into the topic of irritable bowel syndrome while the low FODMAP diet information was just starting to be published. And I found that a lot of my colleagues were coming to me with questions about the nuances of it and, about the literature around irritable bowel syndrome, because it was really at a point where things were kind of shifting from what they kind of considered like, something that was all in your head, a disorder that was, anxiety ridden or caused by, and like more common in women, to, oh, there's something more going on here. So, in diving into the literature and just kind of living it myself, when I started private practice, I knew there was a huge gap around irritable bowel syndrome and functional gut disorders, or disorders of gut brain interaction specifically. I'm pretty sure my IBS is post-infectious IBS. I had Norwalk in university. I had like IBS-D for probably 9 months after that. And then slowly over time, I kind of shifted into the IBS-C category, and that's where I've stayed. Lucky me. Sometimes I think I don't meet the diagnostic criteria for IBS. I have great months, and right now I'm like, oh my gosh, my IBS is so bad. So it's normal to have fluctuations, and it's normal to have it not all figured out. And I think that's what a lot of people experience when they experience a functional gut disorder, any gut disorder.
Well, and there's this expectation that, anything that quote unquote works for IBS is going to make it go away forever. And that's, not the case, and not to sound discouraging, but the idea is that these tools that we learn, like you said, like sometimes I feel like I don't even have IBS. Like you can actually get to that place where a lot of the time you feel dramatically better, if not like totally better, but it is always going to be a part of your life. But once you have those tools, you can sort of like, oh, okay, we're here again. So I lean on my tools and like, this is how I get back to better afterwards.
100%. Exactly. And sometimes like the phase I'm in right now, which I think we'll all go through at some point, is I'm in a phase of adjusting to another concept or another overlapping diagnosis. And so I'm kind of figuring out like medication management, and that's influencing my gut. So, yeah, I mean, it's going to have ups and downs. And I think that's really what we got to figure out is like, what tools and knowledge do we have in our own toolkit to manage and then also advocate as things change.
Yeah, totally. And, it's so interesting for me because I'm an IBS-D gal myself. And I was talking just in the last episode with like Jessica Rowcroft because she's also D. And so it is always so interesting to talk to someone who comes from the other standpoint, if you've constipation and sort of talking about the diarrhea standpoint, if you're diarrhea, talking about the constipation standpoint, because they are very different conditions and they feel very different in the body. And we also approach their like therapeutic nutrition very differently. So I feel like we should just start with like a baseline, and we're not just going to talk about like IBS-C, but we're talking about constipation in general. So like, how do we know if we're constipated? Is it just not pooping? Like, how often should we poop?
Right. So medically, they say, 3 times a week or bowel movements less than 3 times a week is when things become abnormal. But what I find with my patients is constipation can really look different for everybody. And frankly, personally, like if I miss one day of bowel movement, I'm probably not going to the bathroom for 3 more days. So like those 1 day gaps make a big difference. And why it makes a big difference is because of what I think we don't talk about enough is fecal load. So when your colon is full of stool, it really contributes to how you're feeling in your body and how constipation is making you feel overall. And so with that, I have patients that have bowel movements every single day, but they're small, they're inadequate. They don't meet all the diagnostic criteria of constipation, but they're full of stool. They're constipated. And on the flip side, some people can go 3 days without a bowel movement or typically have like a 2 or 3 day cadence and they feel fine. So it's not just frequency, it's how everything's kind of working together. If there's any incidents of, straining or needing any sort of supports to have a bowel movement, stool consistency, all of those contribute to whether you kind of fall into the constipated category.
Yeah. And I feel like I need to highlight that for everyone listening. You can go to the bathroom every single day and still be constipated, because I think that would blow people's minds a little bit.
I agree. And I feel like they experience the symptoms that come along with constipation, the bloating, the discomfort, the nausea, the early satiety, and then they're seeking these, do I have SIBO? Do I have something structurally wrong? When in fact, if we just looked, it might just be that you have a really high fecal burden. And so I think a lot of times people end up waiting a really long time to see a gastroenterologist and maybe go down the rabbit hole of different diagnoses when if we just had an abdominal x-ray to show fecal load, which is pretty non-invasive, we would actually have a really good sense of what's going on. Abdominal x-rays, I feel, are super underrated and underused to actually measure fecal load.
Yeah.
So
I feel like the clients that come through our practice, almost no one has had an abdominal x-ray. And it can be really exactly, someone who's like, well, we don't necessarily know if you're constipated, but my bloating is terrible and I feel so sluggish and I feel full all the time. Like if that person were to go in and get that x-ray and then the physician could clearly see, oh, wow, like you are like your whole colon is just like full of stool, and it would erase all questions. And it's so helpful. And I know sometimes in our healthcare system in Canada, because there is so much conservation of resources, like though that might seem like an unnecessary test, but like constipation shouldn't be underappreciated or underdiagnosed because it has such an impact on people's lives.
And then they go to seek so many other solutions that are more invasive, more resource intensive, that maybe aren't necessary. So I feel like that's like a little gem to take away for your listeners is like if they're questioning whether they struggle with constipation, asking their physician, instead of referring me to a gastroenterologist, I know the wait times are long, I know they're really busy. Do you think we could do an abdominal x-ray? And the family doctor will probably be like, that's a good idea, hopefully, because in my opinion, and your opinion too, I think it is.
Yeah, totally. I want to come back to something that you said because I've written about this before, and it's a little bit of a personal bug for me because you mentioned medically, like we typically say that, if you poop less than 3 times a week, like that's sort of the threshold to say, oh, you're constipated. And I know that that comes from this, paper that looked at, sort of average folks and how often they went. And it was anywhere from like, 3 times a day to 3 times a week. But to me, and I want to know if you agree, again, like so many things we take to be true, where like the actual kernel of research is much smaller than people realize. And if you take the average person who may be sedentary, who may not be consuming, almost undoubtedly is not consuming the recommended amount of fiber. Like, I feel like saying 3 times a week may be your normal, but I feel like it's probably a better idea to be moving your bowels more often than that. Like, if we're trying to reach for like what's optimal, what do you think?
I'm a big believer that daily bowel movements are what people feel best with. Yes, if we skip a day, for a lot of people, it's not the end of the world. Um, but I would say, like, in counseling patients for, the 14 years I've been doing it, a daily bowel movement is really what feels good for most people when they're skipping days, especially if they're consistently skipping days or more than one day. That's when they start to notice pressure, discomfort, um, early fullness, the nausea that comes along with being super constipated. Um, and for people that do struggle with constipation, like if you fall one day behind, you have to work that much harder to get in front of your constipation again.
Yeah.
Which lends to like this fecal loading. A lot of people complain about like really smelly, foul smelling gas just from the stool being over fermented. So it precipitates like a whole host of issues that really influence quality of life.
Yeah. Well, and I think something you said there is so important to reiterate as well, that like every once in a while, if you skip a day, the idea of being like, what is sort of your consistent pattern? Because it's normal for things to go awry every once in a while. Like if you go on a trip or for some reason you have to get up early for a flight and you usually go in the bath to the bathroom in the morning, like it's probably pretty normal that your body's going to be like, oh, okay, I'm not allowed to go now. And you might miss it until the day. So like, it's okay to have some variation, but if like consistently over like weeks and months and years, like that's your normal, that's when you sort of want to think about it.
Yeah, especially when we layer on like the discomfort and the additional symptoms that come along with it. That's like okay, maybe this is something where we have ability to move the needle, improve this for the person.
Yeah. So maybe we should talk now about like what actually causes constipation, because in your new ebook backed up, like you talk a lot about the different kinds of constipation, which I think would really surprise people, because I feel like we think of constipation as one thing, but it could actually be a whole host of things.
100%. So when it comes to constipation, there are different subtypes, and those different subtypes have different underlying drivers. There are a lot of things that can contribute to constipation, but figuring out your constipation subtype can often be really helpful in learning how to manage it. So we do have a free quiz where it helps to discern maybe what subtype you might fall into and start that conversation with your healthcare provider. And then in the book, we dive into them. So the Rome 4 criteria has functional constipation as a subtype, irritable bowel syndrome constipation, or IBS-C. It has medication-induced constipation. So a lot of medications can contribute to slow motility, harder stools, and then defecation disorders. So for example, pelvic floor dysfunction. With that, we've actually added two others to our subtypes because we think they're important to mention and they're often not talked about. Rome 4 is just one way in which we can classify subtypes. So we also have slow transit constipation. So that's actually related to the motility of the bowel. And we're seeing it a lot more with GLP-1 inhibitors and things like gastroparesis or changes in motility after COVID infection, like kind of that long COVID patient. And so slow transit constipation is one that I think is frequently not talked about and addressed very differently than other constipations. And then constipation caused by inadequate energy intake, because that's a big one that I feel like healthcare providers are often not thinking about or top of mind is this person under fueling or over exercising, and how does that contribute to their constipation? So the subtypes really help us to determine then, okay, if you kind of fall, you can fall into more than one subtype, but the most obvious subtype is where we'd start, and then, layer on interventions from there to figure out, what's left, what's remaining, what else do we need to work on.
Yeah. Oh, there's a few that I definitely want to dive into there. And I love that you talked about underfueling, because I think it's really important, particularly in our society where there is such a pressure on weight and body size and dieting, that if you are not consuming enough food to meet your energy needs, it's possible that there's not enough food in the gut to move things along.
Yeah, that. And then also we got to keep in mind that our digestive tract is propelled by smooth muscle, and that muscle needs to be fueled to facilitate bowel movement. So, inadequate intake, there's just not enough there to get things moving, often not enough fiber, sometimes too much fiber if somebody's restricting, but really trying to, eat healthy, so to speak, and overdoing it with the fiber. Sometimes there's not enough fluid when it comes to underfeeding as well. And then, of course, if your body's not getting enough energy, it's not prioritizing energy to your digestive tract to digest and move things along. It's prioritizing things for your heart, your brain. Any sort of movement that you do needs energy. So your gut kind of gets left behind there.
Yeah. And we're going to definitely link to the quiz, because I'm sure people are hearing this and go like, okay, I don't know which one I have. Like, where do I go? So we'll link to the quiz in our show notes. But maybe let's start, because I'm always saying this again and again, that the simplest, least restrictive intervention is always the most intelligent place to start. So, if someone suspects that this is a garden variety constipation, that like they're not on any medications, they're like, no, I'm definitely not under fueling, like what are sort of the basic foundations of what encourages bowel movements that we can maybe address as our first step in looking at constipation?
For sure. So typically when we think of, the garden variety constipation, we're thinking of functional constipation. So there isn't any particular structural or nervous system driver of that constipation. It's just you're not going regularly enough. Sometimes stools are harder. They're kind of like the rabbit poop style stools. There's no pelvic floor dysfunction. Um, and in that case, we'd look, and in most actually cases with constipation, we'd first take a look at fiber. And I know everybody talks about fiber for constipation, but the reality is a lot of people don't meet their fiber targets each and every day. And with constipation, it's like really a consistent thing. Like you think about if you have a weekend where you're eating out more at friends' houses for dinner, or eating breakfast a bit later, you might not hit your fiber targets Saturday, Sunday, and then you get back on the fiber wagon on Monday, and your body has kind of slowed itself down from not enough fiber. So fiber really helps to improve stool consistency. Certain fibers help to gel and bulk the stool, and it can actually help to propel things along as well. It pushes things through, make sure your bowels are moving at an appropriate speed. As well, when that fiber gets to the colon, it ferments, it produces beneficial compounds and lowers the acidity of the stool, and helps things to move along there as well. So fiber is a crucial first step in helping to manage kind of garden variety, less severe constipation. I'll caveat that with, if you're full of stool, fiber is not the best place to start. So if you're like, I've tried fiber and I feel so much worse, there's a good chance you're probably full of stool. And that fiber could be precipitating a worsening feeling of bloat and fullness. So with severe constipation, we typically resolve the stool back up first and then start layering in the fiber.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. And it's such a great example of how in nutrition, like two things can be true at once. Like it is highly possible that chronically under eating fiber has contributed to the constipation. But once really severe constipation sets in, just plopping a bunch of fiber on top of it is actually going to make you feel 10 times worse. Like it can't be the first step.
Absolutely. And I'll caveat this with um, fiber from food can be really helpful and is typically the focus, but there's also like therapeutic fiber supplements that have really specific actions in the gut. And if you're more of like a mild to moderate kind of severity of constipation, those fiber supplements can actually be a great place to start kind of getting closer to your fiber target. Once things are moving along, then you can really kind of work towards hitting the fiber target consistently.
Yeah. In this case, what kind of fiber supplements do you tend to lean on in your practice?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of psyllium. It's kind of the OG of fiber. And what we know about psyllium is it's poorly fermented in the gut, so it doesn't typically tend to produce a lot of gas for most individuals. And if you've ever stirred psyllium into a cup before, you can kind of see it thicken and gel. And so that's what it's doing in your intestines, creating good stool consistency, helping things move through. And for people that struggle with sensation to go or passing stool, it can actually be really helpful because that stretch in your colon helps to actually stimulate that nervous system response of, hey, there's stool here, let's facilitate a bowel movement. So that it can be really helpful for people that struggle with pelvic floor dysfunction, sensation, might have slow transit constipation related to nervous system function. It's kind of really like a jack of all trades when it comes to fiber.
Yeah. I
It can be not super palatable though. So, um, if you think of it like I actually don't find it that bad. Like, you take it like a medicine. You're not taking it like it's, you know, uh, a tasty beverage or something.
yeah.
Um, but if you really struggle with the consistency, I tend to lean a little bit on partially hydrolyzed sorghum. It does have some good research as well. And I find my patients tend to do quite well with it. It's not super well fermented either, so not big gas producing, doesn't thicken water, and it's a good secondary option.
Yeah. My husband calls psyllium like drinking wet sand. And so we put it in things, and I find like, sort of like overnight oats, or like if you sort of like think of it as a food, then for some reason you can wrap your head around that sort of like jelly neutral consistency a little bit more. But the partially hydrolyzed guar gum is also such a good, because I feel like most people don't talk about it as well. So I think there's not as much awareness of guar gum
Mm-hmm.
as psyllium. But I also think that, like as soon as we talk about fiber, in the next breath, we need to talk about water, because one of the
Mm-hmm.
biggest mistakes people can make is not shoring up their water routine as they're increasing fiber.
Especially if you're like putting psyllium into things, or maybe you opt for the psyllium capsules, which it's really hard to hit fiber targets with the psyllium capsules, so they're not typically my go-to unless you're really struggling to get it in. But yeah, we do really need to make sure you're hitting your fluid targets when it comes to fiber, because that gelling effect occurs because of interaction with fluid. And we actually can use psyllium for diarrhea management as well, but we just mix it with less water. So we don't want to, gel too much so that, you're experiencing a little bit of a slowdown. We want to have it gel the right amount to help things move through. So people definitely want to be hitting their fluid targets. I do find most people do a pretty good job with fluid, but if you find like the person that forgets sits at their desk all day and forgets to drink, that could be a sign that you got to be more mindful of how much fluid you're consuming. Um, and fluid isn't just water. Your coffee counts, your tea counts, your milk counts, all of it counts towards fluid intake, so that's something to consider as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And, so once we've sort of gone through, okay, you're like, I've done the fiber thing. It's either making things way worse or it's not really working that well. I know that I'm drinking enough water. Like, where do we get into the maybe this is IBS? Like, what differentiates constipation predominant IBS from just garden variety functional constipation?
Right. So the biggest differentiator is pain, actually. So I like to think of it like a spectrum. I find a lot of people with constipation can experience pain. It's pain that kind of persists when we're trying to resolve constipation, or pain is like the predominant feature, the most distressing feature of the constipation. And so when it comes to IBS, we see that how we sense digestion plays a role in symptoms, that pain being the predominant feature. So that stretch, that gas production can really worsen pain associated with irritable bowel syndrome. And then a bowel movement tends to make it feel better. Um, Again, constipation can experience discomfort and pain. It is not fun to be full of stool. Um, but if we start to resolve that constipation and the pain is still a predominant feature, you're probably in that IBS-C category.
And how would we approach IBS-C differently than functional constipation?
Yeah, so I definitely see a lot of times people get diagnosed with IBS and they might know they fit into the D, diarrhea category, or C, constipation category, but a lot of times they just get recommended the low FODMAP diet. And I like the low FODMAP diet. It's very helpful for pain associated with bloating and gas. But if the constipation is not resolved, it's probably not going to make too much of a difference. So I actually always tackle IBS-C the same way I tackle functional constipation at the beginning, and then layer on things for pain management if necessary, whether that's dietary approaches like the low FODMAP diet or layering in medication management specific for the pain piece of irritable bowel syndrome alongside their gastroenterologist.
Yeah, that's so helpful because I do think, and I'm not sure about your practice, but in our practice here in BC, we see a lot of the times that IBS diagnoses are coming straight from the GP, so they're not often being
Mm-hmm.
referred on to the gastroenterologist. And so now that the low FODMAP diet is so well known, uh, often GPs will say, "You've got IBS, go on the low FODMAP diet." And people are not aware of the role low FODMAP plays, So for diarrhea, that those osmotic sugars, so we've got less of those water magnets in there. For both IBS-D and C, that fermentation could lead to less pain. That lack of fermentation could lead to less pain. But the constipation piece could even technically get worse with low FODMAP because we're removing so many high fiber foods like whole grain wheat, like legumes. And so it's really important for people to hear when you say, we do actually have to tackle this constipation piece or the rest of it is not going to get better long term.
Mm-hmm, 100%. And we don't often talk about IBS-M or IBS mixed, where people swing from diarrhea to constipation, but I find the majority of the time we still have to resolve the constipation in those patients before we can tackle what's left. Because a lot of times I find they're so full of stool, they actually get overflow diarrhea, or their body's trying to like compensate for being full of stool. So they are constipated for several days. Then they experience looser stool, then they swing back. And if we resolve the constipation, there's none of this like pendulum swinging that's happening. So constipation is kind of at the root of IBS-C and IBS-M first.
Yeah. And that's so important for people to hear because I think the presence of the diarrhea might lead them not to suspect that in fact they are constipated. They're like, well, if I have diarrhea, I can't
Mm-hmm.
possibly be constipated, right?
Right. And what's missed is like how overflow diarrhea contributes, or how your body's like trying to catch up and settle that score on that constipation. So it kind of overcompensates and then you swing back, and just getting some regularity there can be really helpful.
Yeah. So maybe upon hearing this, people are like, well, I wonder if I should, just try and eat some fiber, drink some water, or if I should talk to my doc. Like, what are some signs that actually
Mm-hmm.
This is not even a go at your own situation. Like, you want to talk to your doc immediately.
Yeah, so I mean, ideally, in an ideal world, I feel like everybody should talk to their doctor if they're having any sort of bowel symptoms that are distressing. We're starting to see, occurrence of colorectal cancer at much younger ages. And a change in your bowels, especially as it relates to constipation or diarrhea, even can be a sign of colorectal cancer. And you might not even be at the age for screening yet. So, I think screening, even though they just lowered the threshold a few years ago, it's still, there's still a subset of people that we need to consider. And so ruling out colorectal cancer is important. If you've had a sudden change in your bowels, that's important to talk to your doctor. If there's weight loss associated, if there's blood in your stools, even if you think it's from hemorrhoids, still get it checked. I think a lot of people are quite nervous about bringing up constipation with their doctor because they're like, hey, they're busy. I'm just constipated. Well, constipation can be a symptom of hypothyroidism. It can be, a sign that the medications you're on might need to be adjusted. There's so many things that constipation might need additional workup around.
Yeah. And it's so important for people to hear that, constipation can sometimes be just constipation, but it can also be something else, particularly with that colorectal cancer piece, because for some reason, and I'm sure it's because it has to do with our butts, like we would like to pretend that it doesn't exist when it's such a common form of cancer in North America. But you also mentioned hypothyroidism, which is
Mm-hmm.
also on the rise. Can you talk about like what the connection is that like is constipation being caused by the hypothyroidism? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, for sure. So recently diagnosed hypothyroidism right here, unfortunately for me. And yeah, so essentially, when your thyroid isn't functioning properly, it can precipitate worsening constipation. And with proper medication management, it can help to alleviate that constipation. That being said, I think reference ranges are reference ranges, and some people don't really find like we have those reference ranges for thyroid. And, if constipation is persistent or you were managed, but, all of a sudden your constipation gets worse, that's a sign that maybe you should get your thyroid looked at, get the medications looked at, because I think a lot of times with hypothyroidism, constipation is kind of one of those first little, oh, something's going on. I need my thyroid checked.
Yeah. Yeah. That again, too, it's such an important check-in because our thyroid health is so incredibly important. And it's one of those things that can be fairly silent or, with symptoms that we just
Mm-hmm.
explain away as like, oh yeah, I'm busy. I'm like not eating well. And like, that's why I'm constipated. So it's like, take your health. If you're hearing this, this is your sign from the universe to take your health, and any little symptoms that you're like, I just don't know why that's happening to me, like take them seriously and go get them checked out by your doc.
Mm-hmm. 100%. I think it's like 1 in 10 women have hypothyroidism. It's pretty significant.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's the exact number, but I believe it's around that.
Yeah, it is really significant. And, I want to mention one other thing. Speaking of things we do not talk about enough and that many people aren't even aware exists, say you've gone through, a diagnosis, and you're like, I'm constipated. I've tried the things we've tried, we've tried lifestyle, we've tried diet, we've tried some medications. I'm like, what is going on here? The fact that your pelvic floor could be at play, I think would blow people's minds. Can you talk a little bit about like one, what is our pelvic floor? And two, how does it get in the way of pooping?
Absolutely. So this is a big one, especially for women, although men absolutely can have dysfunction of their pelvic floor. So to facilitate a bowel movement, our pelvic floor is kind of like a diamond that our rectum goes through. And so essentially our pelvic floor acts like a support, and part of facilitating a bowel movement requires the pelvic floor to relax so that stool can move through. So typically when people think of pelvic floor, they think of pelvic floor strength and Kegels. But when it comes to pelvic floor for a bowel movement, it's actually about the coordinated relaxation of the pelvic floor to facilitate a bowel movement. At the same time, your diaphragm also has to move down and intra-abdominal pressure has to increase. So there's actually several reasons why defecation disorders can lead to constipation. And so in terms of pelvic floor, women are more likely to struggle with pelvic floor dysfunction, but I also see it in men as well. And typically you don't really get much testing through the medical system for that. So there are tests, balloon expulsion, anorectal manometry, can take a look at that coordination of bowel movement. But unless you're referred to a motility clinic, you're probably not going to have access to that, at least in Alberta. And I think BC is probably even more limited, to be honest.
Yeah.
And so this is where pelvic floor physiotherapists come in. So pelvic floor physiotherapists are physiotherapists that are specially trained in assessing pelvic floor. And they can actually assess how you coordinate your bowel movement and relax your pelvic floor, and then give you strategies to help make sure that the pelvic floor is properly facilitating a bowel movement. There's also some things with positioning that are really easy to do. There's, different small strategies you can do at home to help relax your pelvic floor to facilitate a bowel movement. For example, using a squatty potty is one of them. Your pelvic floor can much more easily relax if your knees are above your hips, to properly position your rectum and allow that pelvic floor to relax. Blowing through a straw or pretending to blow bubbles can help your pelvic floor to relax because it moves your diaphragm down. There's a lot of different things that you can do really simply to get that pelvic floor relaxation. And then physio is really going to be where it's more targeted and specific to you.
Yeah. A squatty potty is one of the unsung heroes of like a good, especially because they are
right?
like pretty affordable, all things considered, and you just like pop it on the floor and you put your feet on it. And then it's just like everything better into position. But that straw hack is so good too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, a lot of people don't know what it's like to actually try to relax your pelvic floor, so that flowing through the straw motion, you can kind of start to feel what that sensation is. A lot of people strain to have a bowel movement, which is like more of a muscular contraction rather than a pelvic floor relaxation.
Yeah.
There's also some things where, your nervous system isn't properly coordinating, like sphincter control or generating appropriate intra-abdominal pressure. But most commonly it's pelvic floor dysfunction contributing. So if you've had like a back injury or even like knees, hips, that sort of thing, all of those things can definitely contribute to pelvic floor dysfunction. And I think that's where men kind of get left behind, is they're like, I've never birthed a child. My pelvic floor can't be involved, but it definitely can.
Yeah, totally. And what about movement? Where does just physical activity sort of fit into all of this?
Mm-hmm. So physical activity really does help to create that like mechanical force to help your body move stool through. It's also a great way to kind of help your nervous system relax and allow your body to prioritize the rest and digest mode when we're focusing on gentle movement. Yoga really does help to, with its twists and stretches, does help to kind of create that mechanical force that helps stool move through, helps gas move through. So really when it comes to constipation management, gentle movement tends to be more beneficial. Walking, running, anything where you get that like gravitational force with each step. And then stretching, yoga, tai chi, that sort of thing for like the twisting and kind of moving things along, helping mechanically. Also, of course, exercise allows us to facilitate deep breathing, and your pelvic floor and your diaphragm are connected. So your diaphragm has to move freely to help generate intra-abdominal pressure and help that pelvic floor relax. If your diaphragm can't move down, it's not going to generate intra-abdominal pressure needed to facilitate a bowel movement, and it's not going to allow that pelvic floor to relax. So exercise allows us to give our bodies a chance to do deep belly breathing that we may not get elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so helpful. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about fiber with respect to supplements, but now if someone's like, okay, but like, how do I just improve my diet? Like, how should we introduce fiber? If, you know, someone's listening and like, no, I get it. There is not a lot of fiber in my diet. And, you know, I got to change that. Like, how do we go about changing? Because of course we can't go from 0 to 60 overnight. Otherwise that's going to feel like a massive disaster.
Yeah, so in the book, we actually outline two different approaches. One where people who are really keen or interested can track their intake and assess their fiber intake and work towards that fiber target goal. And one that's a little bit more casual. So more just like kind of hitting that checklist if you don't want to put too much think or work into it. And so, like you mentioned, we can't just go from 0 to 100 with fiber. We got to start slow and build up. Your body's got to get used to that extra fiber and get used to the stretch that it creates, get used to how it's going to change those bowels. So usually I'd say like adding in 1 serving of fiber-rich food, making sure you tolerate it for a few days, and then going up from there is a reasonable place to start. Some really simple strategies, of course, is to try to get in a serving of fruits or vegetables at each eating opportunity, just to kind of keep that at the forefront. Fruits and vegetables are great sources of fiber. Whole grains are great sources of fiber, and so many people are nervous about grain products, and then they miss out on the opportunity to get fiber-rich food. Especially, you know, a lot of people inherently cut gluten from their diet because they think maybe it's going to improve their bloating. But when they do that, they're missing out on fiber-rich food, and oftentimes their constipation can worsen. So getting in those whole grains where you can. I'm a big fan of sprouted grain bread for that reason, because it's so fiber-rich and it's such an easy way to get the fiber targets in. Whole grain pastas, lentil-based pastas, chickpea-based pastas are kind of like really easy ways to kind of up the fiber intake.
Yeah.
Nuts and seeds are another great option. Incorporating in, you know, a 1/4 cup of nuts or seeds in your day to help reach that fiber target. They're also a good source of magnesium, which can help regulate your bowels. And then pulses. So incorporating in beans, peas, lentils. Depending on where you're starting, you want to start small with that because they are highly fermentable, and work your way up from there.
Yeah. Okay. So really sort of working 1 serving at a time, waiting for your body to adjust, things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. I feel like gluten-free has just become so normalized now, which if you have celiac disease or non-celiac gluten intolerance is incredible because it's so much easier to eat. But people also forget that inherently taking out many of those grains means you're lacking fiber. And if you are gluten-free and you're listening to this, you're like, how do I get fiber? Well, you can still get those fiber nuts and seeds and things like quinoa. Mm-hmm. But, you know, if you're not thinking consciously about it, when you ditch gluten, there goes a whole bunch of fiber sources that can contribute to that constipation too. Are there any for people who are, you know, a little bit nervous about fiber or looking for something that they can add to their diet that's just going to be a little bit more stimulating, you know, like prunes are a classic example? Or what kind of foods like that do you like that maybe could be a first step, like a first food that people could try to start like initiating those bowel movements?
Right. So in the book, we actually have like a constipation superfoods list of some of our favorite add-ins because, you know, I'm a busy mom, you're a busy mom. Sometimes I need those really simple, easy wins. So like, yeah, I could add up how much fiber I eat in a day, but I don't have time to do that. So this list is really meant to be an easy adder to up your fiber and then also get some added benefits of these particular foods to help with constipation. So a really popular one is kiwi fruit, and research shows that 2 kiwi fruit a day can help to improve frequency and consistency of stools, equivalently to adding psyllium or using prunes. A lot of people find it's actually less bloating than prunes because prunes are a source of sugar alcohols. Sugar alcohols are those water magnets you talked about. And yes, they can pull a lot of fluid into the bowel and soften stool, but they can also feel a bit more bloating, especially for those with IBS. So kiwi fruit, actually in a comparator study, was preferred. I'm finding right now I'm really loving like the golden kiwi fruit because it's a bit sweeter. I find them to be a little bit more consistent in terms of like too hard, too sour. So they tend to be quite the hit in my house, and they're really easy to freeze and throw in a smoothie, throw in a yogurt bowl, throw in on top of your oatmeal, or just snack on. So they're a big winner.
Yeah, they're very popular in our house too because you can get the 3-pound of kiwi, because I find that kiwis are really pricey at my local store, but you can get the 3-pound bin of kiwis at Costco, which is so much less expensive. And then like my family just like gobbles them up, just eats them like apples and loves them.
Right? They're super easy. Yeah. Another really good one is ground flax. So up to 2 tablespoons of ground flax a day has been shown to really help alleviate constipation. So we talked about like the fiber supplements, but that's actually kind of like a food first approach if you're not super into those fiber supplements. I find it adds really simply to yogurt or oatmeal or in smoothies. And I find it's not too difficult to hit the 2 tablespoons.
Yeah. I love
chia seeds, of course, are another easy one, similar to ground flax. Of course, if you've added water to chia and seen them expand, that's really what we're going for in your bowels. Really easy adders to overnight oats. You can put them in a smoothie. They have quite the gelling effect though, so it's kind of a time-sensitive smoothie, I find.
I love that. Time sensitive. Do not delay this smoothie, and maybe add like a splash more, milk or water or whatever you're doing.
And that's really where that fluid comes in, is we want that gelling effect to create the right consistency in our bowels.
Totally.
Pears with skin. Pears are super high in fiber. They tend to be a really affordable fruit. I find they're a really great option to really up your fiber intake. And then the types of sugar alcohols in them can help to soften stool as well. So that's definitely a nice and easy go-to.
Yeah. I love this list. So you mentioned, let's talk a little bit about Backed Up, because you mentioned that you have this constipation superfood list in there. Like, what can people expect from Backed Up, which is completely like 100% about constipation, which is incredible. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yes, so this book was kind of funny in that I had intended it to be kind of like, this short little, mini book. And then I started it and I was like, well, one, constipation is very near and dear to my heart, if you can't tell, but there was just so much out there that nobody's talking about, from constipation subtypes to considering your transit to just like beyond getting enough fiber. It's like, okay, but like, tell me how to do it. We also dive really deep into medication management so that you can be your own best advocate, because constipation is this dance, right? There's that fluctuation, and knowing how to strategically use over-the-counter or pharmacological agents to help manage your constipation can be really effective. I've had so many people, go to the doctor and end up being like, oh, like maybe it's SIBO, but we haven't actually done the work to manage the constipation first. So that first, and then all the other stuff after. We also have a really great section on developing your own personal poop plan. And it's really to help you put all this information into action. So I'm hoping it reads for you guys like, your own personal dietitian in book form, because it's really super comprehensive. Of course, sometimes it's nice to have the expert
Yeah.
eyes on your case, but it's not always an option, which is why we put this book together.
Yeah. Well, and for both of us as dietitians, like I wish everybody could see a dietitian, because I think people don't realize until you actually sit down in front of an experience that you're like, whoa, you know that? You can help me. Like people have no idea like how we can help them one-on-one, but I also know that it's not available to everyone. And so having a resource like this, because it does read A, like your own personal dietitian, but B, the other thing that I love is that it is so deeply practical, because I think there's a lot of information floating around out there. But for someone to say, so what do I actually do right now? And then what do I actually do tomorrow? And you really lay that out for people, which I think is what makes it so valuable. And we'll be sure to like link it from the show notes so that everybody can check it out for themselves.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great read. Our team really did a lot of work on it. So I think we put together a really cool resource that's different than anything else you'll find out there about constipation.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so this is the perfect point to, wind into the rapid fire questions. So 5 like little getting to know you questions. First one being, what is your secret talent or like weird skill?
Oh my goodness, my secret talent. Um, Lately it's been golf, to be honest. Like people are asking me to go in tournaments with them. Like I'm not that good, but like I don't know. I feel like they must think I'm that good. So like that's kind of been my secret thing.
Yeah.
I'm also like super good detective, whether that's like finding random information about like things on the internet or constipation. Like I'm like super deep dive analytical. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank goodness you are. Okay, your fave weeknight meal when you're just feeling exhausted. You're like, I don't want to cook, but I am going to cook. This is what I make.
Yeah. We do like at least once a week, we're like salmon, green beans, and sweet potatoes. Um, it's just so easy. It's something my entire family will eat. They can kind of dress it up how they wish.
Yeah.
So it's just like an easy kind of like sheet pan kind of meal. Line them with tin foil, and you don't really have dishes after. So that's a big one for our family.
Sheet pan meals save lives, for real.
Right.
Okay, so your other sort of like secret talent that many people won't know is that you now live in beautiful, sunny Baja, California. So I wanted to ask you, because I'm all about the recommendations, like where is your favorite place to eat in Cabo right now?
Oh my goodness. There's so, like, you cannot go wrong with food in Cabo. There are so many restaurants and they're all so good. Um, we really like a Mediterranean restaurant called Yaya. So if you're in Baja California and you want to check out, kind of like it's in a really fancy hotel, but they just have like down to earth Mediterranean food, lots of like veggie forward options, which is not common down here. So we like to like go there for lunch and have these really big, fantastic salads or grab a pizza. It's just nice, casual.
Nice. Yeah. I have yet to get down there to visit. I have always wanted to go. Okay. So, next one, you have 20 minutes all to yourself, which I know seems probably impossible. The fact that you also like run 2 businesses, but you have 20 minutes all to yourself. You're not allowed to be productive, not allowed to be productive in the home, not allowed to be productive at work. What would you do?
Read. I love reading. I love fiction. I keep trying nonfiction, but I just like can't, you know, I want to like lose myself in a different world. So, what am I reading right now? It's not like the Akatar series, but it's by the same author. So, kind of like uh, fantasy, I guess, is what I'm reading right now. But I love all your book recommendations. I screenshot them all and add them to my Goodreads. And yeah, 20 minutes and I'm reading.
You know,
Yeah.
fiction is same. I have read fiction first and like form, like I read the occasional nonfiction, but exactly like I want to lose myself in another world. Nonfiction is for work. Like,
Right? I
like
have
when I
enough
want to,
research papers piling up on my
yeah,
desk.
when I want to rest, it's fiction, 100%. Okay, last one. Your favorite can't live without it condiment.
Oh my goodness. Salsa matcha. It is like this Mexican chili salsa with sesame and pumpkin seeds in it. And it's like smoky and spicy. I put it on everything. Yeah. If I see you in person at some event, I'll bring you a little jar because it's
Yes.
so good.
Yes, please. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Andrea. This episode is so jam packed with really practical, really useful information. I think that constipation is something we overlook, that we sort of like snicker about, but it is actually really serious and has a serious impact on how we feel on a daily basis and how our body is operating. So I know that it's going to be so helpful for people.
Thanks for having me, and yeah, I hope this episode helps somebody out there struggling.
For sure.